out. I'm a professor of psychology at the Furkhoff Graduate School, and we're just so glad that you're joining us tonight. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, or SEPI, and the Furkhoff Graduate School of Psychology. We have a really wonderful group of presenters here. The webinar series was developed by Shigeru, who is also here and past president of SEPI. It's been a really great way for us to gather while we've all been stuck at home. Nice that we're starting to open up a little bit. So I want to thank everyone who is attending, especially because this is a really unique webinar and you had to complete measures in order to attend. So we know that you really put some time and effort into getting here. This webinar is part of a research project that has two phases. The first phase is tonight, the webinar. At the end of the webinar, when you log out, you should be taken to a landing screen for post-webinar measures. Those should take you approximately 5 to 7 minutes to complete, and we would really appreciate your time in completing those. If you can't complete them right away, you will receive an email tomorrow that will include a link to those measures. The second phase of the research project involves a sequence of 4 weeks of deliberate practice for multicultural orientation coaching. That's a once-a-week group for 4 weeks, and it is free. We have some wonderful supervisors who are offering that. So for anyone who is a trainee, if after the webinar you're interested in participating in those free coaching groups, there will be an opportunity to sign up for those within the post-webinar measures. We're going to be using the Q&A and the chat features today. Feel free to put questions in the Q&A. Jesse and Karen will be prompting us to use the chat as well. And just want to encourage everyone to think about joining SEPI. It's a wonderful organization, a great way to think about and learn about how to integrate psychotherapy approaches and how to integrate clinical practice and research, many different forms of integration. I want to quickly introduce our speakers tonight. Jesse Owen is professor in the Department of Counseling Psychology at Denver University. He's a licensed psychologist with a private practice in Denver, and he is the lead psychologist at Lifelong Inc. In addition to these roles, he's the research director at Celeste Health and the editor of the journal Psychotherapy. His research focuses on psychotherapy processes and outcomes, multicultural orientation, as well as romantic relationships. Karen Tao is an assistant professor in the counseling psychology Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Utah. We've got our Mountain States represented tonight. She also directs the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Master's Program. Karen's clinical and research interests are guided by an overarching goal to reduce disparities in the access, service, and quality of mental health and education for historically marginalized groups. All right, I'm going to be turning my camera and my sound off, but I will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat. Really looking forward to learning from both of you tonight. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks for having us. We're excited to be here, and thank you for everybody who's spending time out of their busy days to join us here for this webinar. So as Tracy mentioned, my name is Jesse Owen. I'm a professor at DU. And I come by this work in a lot of different ways, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the stories that have led Karen and myself to develop the MCO framework. But part of it is really based on my own identities, growing up as a biracial man, lower SES, growing up really poor, and then moving myself through the economic ladders. And a lot of experiences also as being white passing and in conversations that are sometimes jarring, but also informative to my work. And so that's a little bit of where I'm coming from when I come to this presentation. And I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of your questions as we go throughout the day. Karen?
Hello, everyone. It's really good to be here. Great to see folks from all over the world joining us today. My name is Karen Tao, and I'm a faculty at the University of Utah. And I usually start my introduction by saying I'm originally from Hilo, Hawaii, which has shaped a lot of who I am and my identities. For those of you who have been to Hawaii, it is quite a multiracial and multicultural place. And so a lot of my own identities as an Asian American woman, as a daughter of immigrants, has really been influenced by my interactions in Hawaii. And then since then, I've lived in the UK. I've lived on the East Coast, the Midwest, Pacific Northwest, and now in a mountain state. And so it's quite remarkable at how all of these experiences living across different places has shaped my own multicultural orientation. And so excited to be here today and talk about the stuff that Jesse and I have been talking about for over a decade.
Yeah. Okay.
So Jesse, folks can see the notes pages too.
Oh.
So I think we just have to use the, just share the slides as a presentation.
Oh, gotcha.
Mhm.
Man. Still not working, huh?
There is a way to just select a portion of your screen to share in the sharing settings. Let's see if I can.
Now, is that working? How about this? Is that better? Okay. Sorry about that. My first time on Zoom.
So we'd like to start off today. Actually, can we go back to the first slide? I'd love to know who's in the room. We have a couple of questions for you all to answer. So Jesse and I, we can't see you, and we'd love to be able to just know a little bit about who's in the room. So Tracy, would you mind asking the first question?
Yep, that's launched.
Thank
Can
you.
you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay. And when I think we have kind of critical mass, I'll end polling and then I can share it with everyone.
Perfect.
Great. Looks like a good mix.
Yeah.
All graduate students.
Mhm. Nice. Thank you for being here. Great. A nice mix. Thanks. We
I
can
stop that share.
Yeah, we can do the next one.
Nice. So for some of you, this might be a little bit of a refresher and hopefully some new information as Karen and I have added in stuff as we keep on researching the MCO framework.
Just sharing those results with everybody now.
Great. Also, as much as possible, we do want this to be interactive. So as you do add stuff into the chat from your own experiences with the MCO framework, that's awesome for everybody attending, including us.
You guys want the third poll now?
Yes, please.
Great, no right or wrong answers here, but just good for us to know kind of where you're coming from.
Okay, so nice.
All right, all good on those?
Thank you. This is helpful. So we just took a little bit of got a little thin slice of folks where you're all at. And I just also invite you to just notice your level of comfort around particular topics that we bring up as we move forward. And let's begin. So I'd like to begin with us reflecting about a time when we learned something new about a client or a friend you thought you knew very well and were then surprised by what you learned. How did it feel to learn this new piece of information? How did this influence your subsequent interactions or change your relationship with the client or a friend? And then what did you learn about yourself? So this person might come up really quickly for you. You thought about a time when, wow, I know this person for years. I've worked with this client for years. And then suddenly I learned this new piece of information and it shifts our interaction, or it shifts the way that maybe you think about the way you are in that relationship. So we ask you to engage in this reflection and maybe hold on to this interaction as we talk about multicultural orientation tonight. Next slide. The next slide that I'm showing you are results from the most recent election in the United States. And I imagine for those of you who aren't in the US, we're getting lots of news about this very, very controversial election on November 3rd. So I'm showing this to you because it's a visual representation of our country's deep divide. And it was quite remarkable when I started to kind of take a look at these various results. It's hard to pinpoint, I think, for many of us who live in the US, to know where the friction of our political selves intensified and into an earthquake of really unimagined magnitude. And we're still managing the aftershock. And yet here we are, a country divided. And I've been really reflecting a lot about our country's collective cultural rupture. For those of you who understand the rupture and repair cycle and what it might take to begin a collective repair. And for me, I want to move into solution-focused mode. I found it's really uncomfortable to sit with this ambiguity of where we are. But I also think it's helpful to sit in this discomfort, because what I've learned, and many of you can probably attest to, is that as experiences as psychotherapists, as graduate students, as parents, as siblings, as human beings, is that when we're in the midst of these crises, of these social crises, the mechanisms through which we start to filter our information and figure out how to move next is really through our values and our worldviews and our biases. And so then when we respond really quickly using these mechanisms, we miss fully recognizing that people are not monolithic. And that you see here, race does not mean political affiliation, that where we live does not necessarily mean education. So, and so on and so forth. And so what does this mean? Why am I bringing this up in this psychotherapy context? Is that many of you might really buy into this idea that therapy is political. And with every interaction and inaction, we recapitulate a larger social dynamic. And so it's much more complex. And so Jesse and I invite you to sort of think about kind of what it means with your holding your own identities and that interplay with your clients, your patients, your students, your friends, your family. And really, in the spirit of multicultural orientation, it is about how do we use our cultural frames of reference to cultivate relationships and understanding.
Great. And so we're going to start with some assumptions about the MCO framework, just to hopefully get us all on the same page here. And that is, when Karen and I were first thinking about MCO, we thought about it as, teaching therapy. Pretty much all human interactions are culturally bound, right? So that our belief, or at least our assumptions, is that there is no culturally neutral interaction between two humans. And then we also believe that by focusing on kind of these cultural discussions, that it can actually enhance social bonds. Even though it can be tense at times, it's actually shown to be beneficial, or can be beneficial. And we also understand that people, clients, therapists have different degrees of insight they have in their cultural understandings, as well as their desire to have these conversations. We also want to differentiate MCO from other models of social justice advocacy. There's a lot of great models out there. And this model was really designed to capture what's happening in the therapy room. So it's not necessarily anti-social justice. We're not saying don't go out and do social change, but rather the constructs within MCO are really focused in on what's happening within the therapy dynamic. And so why does this matter? So it's estimated that there's over 100 million therapy sessions every year, with about 35 to 40% of those sessions occurring with folks from marginalized identities, right? So we're talking about a lot of therapy sessions that could go either really great or could go really poorly in terms of cultural conversations. And so that's what we need to start to think about. How do we affect this at a larger scale? How do we impact it? And it starts with each individual therapist. So let's think about epistemologies. When you think about your theoretical orientation, where does it come from? Why that orientation, right? If you think about orientation in general, it's a lens in which we view the world, right? What sources of information do you use to develop your theoretical orientation? Is it professors? Is it books? Is it going to seminars? I've learned a lot from a lot of different leading experts in the field, and it's great understanding of this. But when I contrast that about thinking about your cultural identity, what identities are most salient to you? And what sources of information did you use to develop your cultural identities? Chances are it's not professors, maybe a little bit in some classes. Lived experiences comes up as one of the top answers to that question. And so when we think about these two different juxtapositions of theoretical orientation and cultural identities, it feels more personal in the ways in which we operationalize and enact our cultural identities in the therapy room.
So the concepts of multicultural competence, multicultural orientation, I think this will be sort of a perpetual question, like what is it? And how do we, like, from what perspective or angle are we kind of looking at it? Is it the kind of person that we are? Are there certain kinds of people and characteristics that make them more multiculturally oriented, or to utilize certain multicultural interventions? Is it specific skills that we develop and learn to be able to work with folks across various backgrounds? Again, is it back to sort of awareness of who we are? Or is it about culturally adapting specific treatments to fit specific groups with specific cultural beliefs? And so in many ways, it's all of these things. And what also makes it a little bit slippery in some ways is that we can be talking about multicultural processes and have very different angles or lenses through which we are thinking about that.
There's also some translational issues when we start to think about adapting treatments. And I do like a lot of the adapted treatments. There's some really good lessons to be taken from there. But it also gets to be a little bit daunting. And that's where Karen and I started thinking through of how do we actually develop a treatment? And then if it's a treatment approach, then we're kind of in this ballpark of manualized treatments or treatments with guidelines. And that's a little bit more tricky when it comes to like intersectionality, for example. And when we talk about intersectionality, we're talking about how different identities align with certain levels of power and privilege within society. So we could develop a treatment for CBT for Asian Americans, for example, but then should we develop another treatment for CBT for Asian Americans who identify as gay? And then you can think through all the different permutations of identities, and it becomes quite daunting. And for you grad students out there, you'd probably be in grad school for 10 to 15 years trying to learn all these different treatments. And so what are the core elements of cultural adaptations? What are the fundamental things that we would like to see therapists do? And Karen and I had this understanding of like, well, we don't really have a great understanding of what knowledge is needed, like what level of knowledge is needed about a cultural group, but knowledge is important, right? We understand that there's different skills that can be useful for treating different populations, for sure. but is that a universal, right? And it may not be. And of course, awareness is key for our model as well as the MCC's model. So I think awareness is one of the unifying factors between the two different approaches. But all that to be said is this is some of the guiding thought process behind the MCO framework. So multicultural process and process-based approaches are more along the lines of common factors, right? This unique dynamic between client and therapist, faculty and students, and society, understanding different cultural values, beliefs, as well as individual needs, right? So we're trying to think through what are these processes and how do we come to the pillars that we did.
So kind of juxtaposing these approaches or frameworks. This is something Jesse and I have talked a lot about. Is it a framework? Is it an approach? Is it a philosophy? I think you pick your favorite, but we've landed on framework for multicultural orientation. And the way in which we distinguish, and not necessarily they're not completely mutually exclusive around multicultural competence and multicultural orientation, is that multicultural competence, as we have seen it talked about, and we were trained within the multicultural competence tripartite model specifically, is that there are a lot of sort of aspects of doing. What do we do in therapy with our clients? What is the knowledge that we need to attain? What are the specific skills that we need to learn? And then what are sort of the awarenesses that we need to be able to cultivate? And multicultural orientation, we see more as a way of being how we are in a room. And as we talk about each of the pillars, you'll see what we mean. It's not necessarily no doing, but the spirit of multicultural orientation is about how we are in the room. And for many of us, we want to know, so does it really matter for our clients? Does it matter? Does it show up in therapy outcomes? And we don't have time today to talk about the various studies that we've conducted or the various studies that we've looked into around MCC or multicultural orientation, but therapy outcomes are impacted by these two approaches and how therapists engage in both.
So let's go over the pillars first, and then Karen and I have picked out some videos for practice. And I know the spirit of this training is to help people practice. And while we can't throw you in breakout rooms today, we do want you to observe the videos, and we have some prompts for you to go through. And if you're a supervisor or if you're just wanting like some self-supervision, we have some questions that you can put down for yourself to kind of reflect on how you're doing. So the multicultural orientation framework has 3 pillars, and we'll go through all 3: cultural humility, cultural opportunities, and cultural comfort. And we see these as intersecting and overlapping, not separate things that you can just peel apart like we'd like to do in research. So cultural humility is, first off, an intra-personal piece of understanding your own values, your own belief systems, also taking an other-oriented and a relationally oriented stance with others, be it clients or supervisees, obviously maintaining respect and lack of superiority, being collaborative, as well as not or observing yourself making judgments, right? It's one area of research that I started out in was clinical judgment research. And some of the clinical judgment research shows that we make decisions really quickly. And one study showed that diagnostic impressions were formed within the first couple of minutes of meeting a client. And so that's a lot of judgment. And we don't see clients for very long relative to how much time they spend outside of therapy. And so we do have to make and formulate judgments somewhat quickly. And cultural humility is a good reminder to say, is that right? Should I be more curious about this thing that the client said or that thing that the client said? And that's kind of the push-pull here of making judgments and also being understanding of that we should be also curious, and we should also question those judgments. Cultural humility and humility research in general is based on the social bonds hypothesis, where there's an intrapersonal piece, as I mentioned before, where people understand their biases, beliefs, and values. And also, and I highlighted this one, openness to feedback and willingness to elicit feedback. And this is as true for supervisors, as instructors, as therapists, that what are you doing to get feedback from your clients? In what way are you doing it? in a way that feels comfortable and collaborative with your students and or clients? Are you giving measures of alliance? Are you checking in if you're an instructor mid-semester to see, hey, how's this working? What can we be doing better, right? And then not only the willingness to elicit it, but then to integrate it, right? That sense of really understanding what we all have room for improvements. And then obviously the interpersonal piece, right? This other orientedness, some curiosity. And we should differentiate that this is an unconditional acceptance, right? We do have judgments. We do have our own values that we want to own, right? And it may be in contrast with the client or with your supervisee. But again, it's all about what you do with those disagreements. It's about how you interact with that. And we see that from the romantic relationship research field, that differences don't necessarily predict divorce. It's how those differences are handled are a better predictor of divorce. And so I think those kinds of things should be front and center. So again, challenges in culture humility is really about when are you challenged and pushed to really question your own values, to really, in those moments when you have disagreements, what do you do with it? And how do you interact with those challenges? It's really easy to be comfortable and to engage in conversations if everybody's on the same page. But what do you do when they're not? The second pillar is cultural comfort. And cultural comfort is the ability to genuinely stay engaged with others holding different or similar cultural identities, even in the face of differences or alignment of values, right? And so again, here we're thinking that cultural comfort isn't necessarily a good or bad thing, right? But it is a thing that we need to monitor. How comfortable are you in this conversation? In some ways, it's analogous to if you're more the psychodynamic route of countertransference or just reactions in therapy that you have towards your client. Like, are you gauging that, and are you gauging it within a cultural frame? So even to take a minute to look at this picture, like what does your initial body reaction have towards this kid? And how do you feel towards the parents? I do a fair bit of couples work, and to me, like one of my first reactions is like, why are you yelling and arguing in front of this kid? Can't you see it's impacting him, right? But other folks might have different reactions of like, maybe it's good for the parents to work things out in front of the kid so the kid has a good role model of, yeah, people can argue, but maybe they come to solutions as well. You know, the way I was raised is that you don't argue in front of the kids. And so one of my first couples therapy sessions, I was like blown off off my chair why this couple was yelling at each other. And again, that was my own cultural views of what argument should look like. So again, as we ask you to do, like we say, do your homework, is really, obviously you're not going to know every single thing that's going to make you uncomfortable, but are you doing some research? Are you doing some personal self-discovery about what are the areas that you are less familiar with? Who are like if you're a supervisor, who are the students that stand out to you that you really enjoy supervising? And who stands out to you that you don't enjoy supervising? And what are the differences between those? Same thing for clients, right? Sometimes we have our favorite clients, sometimes we don't. And again, those types of aspects of exploration are important to do prior to jumping into therapy sessions. I also noticed that over time, and this happened right around the 2016 election. And I remember a conversation with Karen. We were talking about social media, and I was like, you know, my social media, and I want to be like exposed to all sorts of different things, but my social media looked a lot like the right-hand side of the screen. Everybody's saying the same thing. Everybody kind of championing the same view. And yet I wasn't hearing other sides. I wasn't hearing other points of view. And so when we say do your homework and try to think through what is it that you're being exposed to, be it from podcasts to documentaries to books that you read to articles that you're discovering, who are the people, who are the authors of those? What positionality do they have? And is it a diverse set of individuals? The other piece to realize, if you're an instructor, if you're a supervisor giving assignments, we encourage you to think through, again, those same questions. Take a look at your syllabus, take a look at your readings. How diverse are those readings and who are they coming from? What voices are being represented? So simple things, doesn't have to be massive changes to everything you're doing, but again, just think through, be intentional about some of these areas. And one last piece about comfort and discomfort. cultural comfort is it does influence humility. And these two things should go hand in hand here, which is information avoidance. The one thing that we do know pretty well is that when people feel uncomfortable, it engages a defense structure, right? And that defense structure, one common thing that we found, at least in our research, is that people just avoid the conversation, right? And so if you read Days Vine's work on broaching, one of the very first stages she talks about is avoidance of the conversation, right? And information avoidance is how racism and discrimination and systems of oppression continue, is that a lot of the times people who have more power and privilege can avoid information and can avoid learning more about these topics because they have more power and privilege, right? And so just think about humility when it comes to, okay, I'm feeling uncomfortable, but I still want to be curious. I don't want to run from this feeling, right? I want to sit with it. And maybe sitting with it with the client right then and there might not be your best idea. Maybe it's going to a supervisor or get some consultation. But again, trying to think through, what am I avoiding in my life and what am I not being exposed to? So again, key aspects here, values impact all aspects of being. Think about what's in your office and what's not in your office. Discomfort's not bad, but something to lean into, and being intentional about developing. Okay. Oh, sorry, last slide. And then Karen's going to jump in. The cultural body scan. So this is what we ask people to do. These questions are really good, kind of fundamental questions after a session, during a session. What are you feeling in those cultural conversations? What are those feelings connected to? Like, what experiences do you have? What memories are coming up? And what do you make of those feelings and experiences? What do they mean in this session with this client or with this supervisee? Right. So again, just some self-supervision or other supervision type questions.
Well, I thought if we could go back to the last slide, Jesse, we could do something right now with the folks in the room. So think about a time when you've had a cultural conversation, and what we mean by that is a conversation that evoked an aspect of your identity. Maybe there was a difference across. It could be that you shared similar identities as well, but that it evokes some sort of charge, maybe some discomfort. Could have been a discussion about religion or politics, or even about your favorite sports team. Where did you feel that? Or where do you feel that charge or that discomfort in your body? If you could enter into chat, what happens? And I can share mine. And for me, it's my heart racing really fast. And it almost feels like it's jumping out of my chest, and I start to get sweaty. So those are my discomfort, like what happens almost immediately in those kinds of situations. So enter into chat where you feel it in your body.
And while people are doing that, I'm just going to jump in. There was a question about, Jesse, if you could highlight who were the researchers who were studying broaching and also information avoidance, an author you referenced.
Yes, Day Vines. It's Day, like Day, then hyphenated Vines. Is her last name, Dr. Day.
Okay, for both of those.
For information avoidance, I can't remember the person off the top of my head, but okay. I can provide a reference down the road.
Okay, I just put that in the chat for the person who asked that. Okay, thanks.
Great. So we're getting a lot of different physiological or somatic responses. People immediately were able to identify. We have stomach turning, shallow breathing, stomach and chest, tension in my hands and shoulders. My back hurts, lower back. Heart feels like it's beating harder as well as faster. My face feels hot. So you all were able to immediately identify where this is, shoulders and chest. And so the next sort of process, I wonder what you all do with that. So for me, well, now that I'm working toward being more attentive to these somatic responses, is I try to suppress it. I try to move forward and not think about it and avoid it. Sort of back to that avoidance, please. And so part of MCO, what we especially around cultural comfort and how it ties to cultural humility, is that that these sort of bodily or somatic responses are really data for us. It's a light going off in our bodies that say, hey, something important is happening here. And rather than avoid it, we might pay more attention and lean into, okay, I'm uncomfortable, my body's doing this, what's happening? And so I want us to sort of highlight this as how this can be really informational and a good resource for us, that our body tells us first. Okay, we're going to keep going with the next pillar. The cultural opportunities. So cultural opportunities are those instances in an interaction. So in psychotherapy, where a client kind of drops a hint around their aspect of their identity, or maybe it's not a big hint, maybe it's a big neon sign that's saying, I really want to talk about this. And the helper or the provider then picks up on this and leverages this moment to say, thank you for bringing this up. This seems really important to you. I wonder if we can dive in a little bit deeper. And sometimes these opportunities don't show up as explicitly. And so a multiculturally oriented therapist might note something that comes up. Maybe the client is hinting around sexuality, for example. And how do we then kind of listen and follow those breadcrumbs to be able to then find a moment where it might be appropriate or helpful to bring it up to the client. They might not even recognize that it is an opportunity to take. Next slide. So here is a client example. The client says, I grew up as a proud African-American Christian man. When I came out to my parents, they told me that nobody in our religious community could know. I think that is when my depression started. So there are lots of opportunities here. And so I haven't added the cultural piece yet. There are lots of opportunities here. So maybe we can just have into chat. So what are some opportunities? What would be one thing that you might want to just follow up on? Maybe you can just type in, what would you want to ask next? About his faith. Great. Thanks, Adriana. Christopher says, were they protecting you or ashamed of you? Others? Again, I want you all to notice what's happening in your body as you're thinking about these things and how you might ask or what you might ask. What are you curious about? Who else does he feel? He can share this with Lauren, sorry. Would make an observation instead of asking. It sounds like they raised you to be proud of some parts of yourself, but then flipped the script to direct you to hide another part of yourself. Great. So many of you are naming some of the cultural pieces here. And if we go to the next slide, we highlight some of those cultural factors. So the cultural focus. Many of you are working with clients where they have intersectional identities. And here we have African-American, Christian man. He came out to his parents. So there's sexuality here, or gender, or another aspect of their identity. And then also we have the mental health piece where that's when my depression started, he says. And so here are a lot of markers that we can sort of pay attention to. And there's so many ways we can go with this, but when we think about cultural opportunities, we want to be able to have both their identities, clients' identities, sort of highlighted. What are those opportunities for us to explore? How that informs their presenting issue. Jesse, did you want to add anything about this specific example?
No, I think you covered it well. The only other thing I would say is that when we talk about markers, we talk about symptom-focused markers versus somewhat culturally focused markers. And I think that it's important to understand that it's not just focusing on culture just to focus on culture, but it's in pursuit of understanding the real being of the person in front of you, and their depression is part of that personhood of the client, and so is all these other aspects too. So it's not right or wrong, get to one or the other, and you have to focus on culture every single time. Obviously, in this example, it's pretty heavy with the cultural identities and how it's impacting this client.
So putting it all together, we have three pillars that are overlapping, and we've added a few questions to help us think about each of these pillars. But first, I want to just draw attention to the top lavender box and the ways in which we get to know each other, get to know our clients, the person across from us, is that we have emotional responses, we have cognitive responses, we have behavioral responses. I forgot to share another one of my cultural discomforts. One somatically, what happens when I'm uncomfortable in a situation where like culture or identity comes up is I've been named the bobblehead when I'm uncomfortable. I do this. And for those of you graduate students who are still videotaping your sessions, this is where it all came to light for me around my behavioral sort of cues of discomfort. And so when I start nodding a lot, that's when I know I'm uncomfortable. And then there's also somatic, and then there's also relational, because for those of you who are thinking about countertransference and transference, what some of the things that are coming up between you and your client that could be from previous relationships that show up in the room. So for these three pillars, cultural humility, cultural opportunity, and cultural comfort, here are some of the questions we can ask ourselves. I'll just pick out a couple. So with cultural opportunity, we use that one example of the client just before this. What aspects of the client's cultural identities are salient? And how might this be important to explore further? And then with cultural humility, we are all drawn to specific aspects of a narrative. And this doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of our own history, our own experience. It could come from past clients that we've met that remind us of the current client. So to ask ourselves to be more curious about that. And we'll practice this, we'll start flexing this muscle of asking ourselves what else as we move forward to practice.
Yeah, I would also add one of the things that we try to emphasize here is that the multicultural orientation framework is really trying to push people to be having conversations and being aware of kind of their comfort level, their level of curiosity in a natural way. And so one of the things that Karen and I had lamented during our training was, even though we were trained in different places, we both had the same experience of, where we had supervisors or trainers that said, you have to address the cultural differences the very first session. So you have to say, hey, I'm a biracial man and you're white. How are we going to get along? Or something along those lines, which felt really artificial. And while it's important to address culture in the first session, I do believe that, we want to make it in your natural voice, right? What's the way that you would naturally relate to another person versus there are no staged things to say. There's nothing that we can tell you that would fit exactly your style. But try them out, right? That's the whole point of deliberate practice and practicing in general, is just to try out new ways of being. I think the other piece that is important to think about in cultural opportunities is it's one thing to follow the client's lead, but it's another thing to create opportunities as well. And so think about yourself and what you're creating to have cultural discussions, be it your intake paperwork, your the way that you conduct your first intake, just how you engage with the client creates opportunities, and it sends a message that this is a place where we can maybe talk about these things if it's important to us. There's a number of good studies that show that not all great therapies, even in cross-cultural dynamics, include a lot of cultural discussions, right? Some do, some don't, and that's just the way therapy is and life is. So, but there are also opportunities that you can create. Like I mentioned this, where after my brother, he committed suicide and I went to therapy, my therapist in the very first session said, Jesse, after getting to know my story a little bit, he's like, sometimes people turn to religion to cope with loss. Is that something that's important to you? And I said, it's not. I'm not a religious person. And he's like, okay, well, let's move on, right? He saw an opportunity, a potential opportunity, listened to me, and just moved on after I said it wasn't important. So again, different opportunities to create a narrative in that way.
Can I jump in with a question?
Yeah.
Lauren Yang asks, once we identify the discomfort, how do we lean further into it, whether in the moment in the room or outside of the session itself? It's a great
Great
question.
question. Yes. I would say both. In the moment, if we are able to have sort of that reflexive moment where we look at ourselves like, wow, I'm feeling really uncomfortable. I'm noticing my heart racing and I'm feeling sweaty. I'm nodding a lot, is to maybe even utilize immediacy with a client and just saying and say, you know, I'm noticing myself having some like somatic reactions to kind of our conversation right now. And I'm wanting to check in with you. And maybe at times, sometimes we're too flooded and overwhelmed by our somatic reactions that we are not ready to bring it up with our clients. And so it can be in supervision where we talk about it. It could be in our own sort of processing of, I wonder why I was so uncomfortable there. But I think that the point being is that we don't run away from it because it could be really informational for us in moving forward.
Yeah, and I love that answer, Karen. And I would just add in, for me, it's at what level am I comfortable in that moment to do immediacy, right? You don't want to potentially botch it. And sometimes it's not always important about what you do in the moment, but it's what you do with what you did, right? So next session, did you bring it back up? And I remember an example when this really hit me in a different way, but like when I was in my master's program down in Miami, I was doing a practicum at the training clinic, and this guy, huge white man, always drove in on a Harley. And he came in one session really hot about traffic and all sorts of stuff. And he started going off with a lot of different racial slurs against Cuban Americans and Cuban immigrants. And then he looks and points to me, he's like, "You're not one of them, are you?" My discomfort level was off the charts. And in that moment, all I did was I lied. I was like, no, which is not actually a lie, but it's like I am still identify as a brown person. And so I was like, technically it wasn't a lie, but like I didn't address the real issue at the heart of it in that session because I just felt so uncomfortable. And so again, those types of moments are so personal. But what I did do was go consult with my supervisor and my peers, right? Like, what should have I done? And those kind of situations are jarring, to say the least. And also, if you do want more reading on if you don't identify as in the majority culture and you do want a kind of a cultural critique of cultural humility in particular, there's a great article by Moon and Sandage that's out there that does get into this aspect of, is it good for us to, is there a cost to cultural humility sometimes for people who are minority identity? Okay. So with this, it's always the question of which way do we go in cultural opportunities. So we're going to switch to some video examples and give you an opportunity, at least individually, to think about how you respond. We'll want you to put your reactions into the chat. Like, what would you say immediately to these different vignettes? Try to avoid saying like, well, I think I would say this, or maybe I would go down this route. Like, what verbatim like would you hope to say if you're in this moment? So this is Anthony. He's a 26-year-old cisgender male, African-American.
I just moved here, so getting adjusted to things, kind of feeling lonely a little bit. Don't get to really do the same things that I used to back at home, like visit family on the weekends, go to concerts, play basketball, play sports with my friends.
We can't see it.
A little tough.
What's that?
Did you want us to see it?
Yeah, is it not?
Okay, we can't see it.
I think probably when you shared your screen, you just shared your slides. Just reshare it. Thanks.
Where did he go?
Hmm.
Oh,
He might be on a different desktop. There he is.
can you see him now?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So again, this is Anthony, African-American single man, computer analyst, moved to a new city. Some symptoms of depression, isolation. Comes to therapy after moving across the country.
I just moved here, so getting adjusted to things, kind of feeling lonely a little bit. Don't get to really do the same things that I used to back at home, like visit family on the weekends, go to concerts, play basketball, play sports with my friends. So it's been a little tough. I kind of get nervous meeting new people, kind of feel like they're judging me a lot. So just kind of feel alone being the only Black person at my job. So it's kind of lonely in that sense.
So you don't have to respond in the camera. You can respond in the chat.
It's fictitious. Not a real client. We have one response. Oh, here they come.
Nice. Great. Go ahead, Karen.
Go ahead. I wasn't sure if you wanted to start having us do some highlighting of different responses.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing. I first want to just have you notice just anything that's coming up for you in your body, any sort of initial thoughts and reactions. And let's start with Joanna Durso, who says, it must feel really lonely, not just adjusting to a new community, but being the only Black person at your job. Would you tell me more about that? Nice. So just wanting to kind of look at the various sort of statements and words. And one thing is a reflection of feeling. It must feel really lonely, being not able to adjust to a new community. And then the part where there is a cultural focus is that Joanna names and uses Anthony's language and says, but being the only Black person at your job. And would you tell me more about that? So that is, definitely one cultural response, multicultural oriented response that we could go in with. Sophia says, that sounds really difficult to have just moved to a new city and not yet know anyone, and makes sense that you're feeling this way. And it also sounds like you're experiencing judgment from others being the only Black person at your job. Nice. So more reflection of feeling, and then also some meaning as well, just like how it must be to be experiencing judgment in a new place. And then again, using the client's language, Black person at your job. And so as Jesse mentioned, we're not going to always use all the language to make sure that it is a culturally focused response or question. However, one thing, just sort of inviting you all to think about how comfortable or uncomfortable you are using specific terms like Black. And no right or wrong here, but just sort of doing a check with specific sort of words and language. So we have another one we're going to practice with.
And Karen, you can see this?
I can see it. Yeah.
And just for all the attendees, just to let you know, these videos were created for a MCO performance task. And so the first video was from the original task that Shakira Haywood developed and for her dissertation. So there's a series of those videos. And what we did is we had people practice and use those videos, and we coded them for MCO type variables. And so this next one comes from Dr. Porter, Emma Porter, another one of my students who developed some videos for her dissertation around rupture repair. So this is Harnini, and she's responding to the question from the therapist, which was, how do you think things are going in therapy?
That's fine. It's been going good. I mean, it's fine. It's completely fine. I mean, whatever happens, and I'm looking at you like the expert. So as long as you think it's good, then I think I'm on track with you. But so what was the focus of the session today?
Again, what would you say next? You want to start with Michael's response or Carly's response, Jesse?
Yeah. So,
Here we are, more that coming in.
yeah, these are good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see some hesitation there, identifying maybe some of the discomfort pieces, which are good. I think the open-ended question piece about would you be open to sharing some of this with me is a really good curiosity stance of humility, for sure. This one's also interesting in a different way. Okay. I think this is also interesting in a different way that she doesn't mention anything culturally explicit, right? There's nothing in there that's culturally explicit. And we use some of this to think through, like, are you thinking through a cultural lens, right? Not every response has to include culture. I also like Angela's response about potentially using humor, depending on your relationship with the clients. If it seems appropriate, humor can be a good way of connecting. One of our upper order defenses. Yes, Hannah, great open-ended question, and just kind of like acknowledging your own role in that, right? Taking some ownership is key for rupture repair. We see that in literature quite a bit from Chris Moran and Eubanks Carter in their work.
Yeah.
Nice. And just some ownership. Yeah, that's great. Just owning that you might have missed something as a therapist. And again, like once you start building in kind of the cultural understanding of what she might be experiencing and maybe exploring that down the road, doesn't have to be the immediate next statement, but potentially maybe some questions that you might have down the road if she does mention some where that hesitation might come from or where that that view of the therapist as an expert might come from. And again, not just assuming that she's, based on her identities, that she wants you to be the expert necessarily, but maybe she does. So. Karen, you good to move on?
Sure. Yeah, I was just reading all of these really great responses, and I wish we could spend more time, but let's keep practicing and take another angle. We can practice a little more. So let's move to the next slide. All right. So Jesse and I have been really interested in also the way that cultural ruptures happen in therapy, and where microaggressions kind of show up in interactions. Many of you are very familiar with what a microaggression is. It's a subtle or stunning, often automatic and often non-verbal exchange, which are put downs and can feel derogatory or dismissive or nullifying of a person's identity. And in a study we did a while ago, we had 120 racial and ethnic minority clients report, over half of them had reported that they had experienced a microaggression from their therapist. And of those, 76% reported that the microaggression was not addressed.
Yeah, in a more recent study, Hook et al. Found that percentage of experiencing a microaggression was even higher, closer to 75%, I believe.
Yeah. So the sort of take home there is that they happen, and but that's not a deal breaker. And we as we know in just sort of everyday experience, that a microaggression does not mean the end of a relationship necessarily, but what's really important is what's done with that rupture. One, that we have awareness that it occurred, and two, that we address it somehow. And so in that same study, for those dyads where a microaggression had occurred, if there was a discussion and there was a successful discussion, they did okay. And it was almost as well as those dyads where there was no microaggression at all. And if there was no discussion and a microaggression had happened, their outcomes did not do as well. And so what really explained that relationship was how strong their working alliance was as well. So take home, address microaggressions if they occur, and also really focus on the relationship. And many of us are, yes, we know the working alliance is a really big deal. In our next video example, we are going to show you clips that a client has experienced a microaggression, not in therapy per se, but one of them does, one of them doesn't. So the first one, I don't have like the funds that Jesse does, where you get these professional actors who come and do this really nice, beautiful videos. So I go on the cheap, I use myself. And so the next example is me. It is a real example that I had encountered. And so KT is your client. And as you listen to KT's narrative, she's coming to you, she's in therapy, she's been there for, she's come and seen you a few times. I'd like you to just ask yourself these three questions. As we go back to the beginning around what are some of the muscles we can start flexing around multicultural orientation, I think that these three are a good start for us. So the first one is, what do you notice? The second question is, what are you curious about? And the third one is, what might be influencing your curiosities? Okay, so let's hear from Karen. It's a little bit longer, so start paying attention to those three questions, and we'll ask you for what you thought.
Yeah, so anyway, the week went a little bit better than last week when we met. But, and then something happened just yesterday, actually, during lunch. I went with one of my colleagues down to Library Mall to get some lunch, and I wanted to try out this new food cart. And so I get to the line ready to order, and this guy comes up to take my order, one of the person working behind the cart, and says, wait, Japanese. No. Korean. No, definitely Japanese for sure. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he goes, you're Japanese, right? Like, I know I can totally tell like the difference between Japanese and Korean. And I said, well, you left one option out. I'm actually Chinese. He goes, oh, really? You don't look Chinese. And it's that moment where I, don't know what to do, whether to kind of walk away and say you're an idiot or school him on how rude and that it's, racist he is to make that kind of assumption about me without even knowing me. Anyway, I'm kind of like a deer in headlights, and I decide to just stick around and order some food. And then he goes, so what do you think about Utah? And I'm like, it's fine. I like it. It's good. He goes, so do you ever think about going back to your homeland? And I'm like, Hawaii? He's like, no, your homeland. Like, where are you from? I'm like, I was born and raised in Hawaii. He was like, but where are your ancestors from? Like, where are you really from? And at that moment, I'm just dumbfounded, Like, what do you think about that conversation? What do you think I should have done? I'm like super, like, my heart's racing and getting really angry, and I'm not even hungry anymore. I just don't even want to eat the food that they're making. Like, do you think I'm from here when you first met me? Do you think that I was born here? Or do you think that I'm like a foreigner, an international student? What was your first impression when you first met me? I don't even know, why he thought to ask that.
Okay. What would you say next?
And just a reminder to everyone, use that pull down menu so that it says to all panelists and attendees if you feel comfortable.
Great. We appreciate the responses. This is good.
Thanks. Thanks for sharing. And again, in the spirit of deliberate practice, to notice sort of what comes up in your body as you are thinking about how you respond to KT. So let's start a little bit from the top. Alexandra says, I hear your question and want to address it, but if it's okay with you, I'd like to invite you to check in with your body and what you're feeling. Just listening to you share this experiencing, I've noticed I'm having a reaction. I'm curious to hear what you're experiencing in your body right now. And and that one really kind of can address sort of your own cultural, like what's happening somatically, and then recognizing that microaggressions are really a somatic experience at first, that then we sort of travels up into cognition and trying to make sense of it. So as a therapist, that's one sort of angle to take around cultural comfort. And I want to go back to Michael's statement. He says, I'm sorry you had to go through that experience. Can you say a little bit more about what feelings came up for you? And, one thing I'm thinking about sort of in the context of where we are sociopolitically, I've had so many conversations with people of color and with a lot of Asian and Asian American folks, especially since the most recent murders in Atlanta. And, a lot of conversations around like what, especially from allies who want to be supportive, like what do you say to folks who have experienced microaggressions? What do you say to folks who have experienced racial trauma or anti-racism? And this is not, kind of in research or anything, but sort of more anecdotally that a lot of folks have shared how oftentimes it is a grief response, that they're grieving. And so that in a response like, I'm sorry, you had to go through that experience can be a really powerful way to sort of start and respond to folks who are sharing their racial trauma with you. And it can be very, very simple. And so I just wanted to kind of note that starting with that can be really powerful. And
I also think there can be some power in, even if the client doesn't name it, there can be, depending on your relationship with the client, some power in naming it as a racist experience. Or maybe this person didn't mean that, but that's racist, right? Like knowing, just kind of acknowledging that can be useful for some clients. Again, you got to use your clinical judgment and kind of see where your relationship is at with that person. But sometimes it can be really powerful as a minority person to have somebody else just name like, yeah, that was racist, right? That was not okay. And that is, and that's probably a little bit further down the road of like cultural opportunities, right? Depending on, again, you don't know a lot about this client. We were only saying a segment of it, but. Tracy, did you say you wanted to ask a question or there was a question?
Yeah, this is going back a few minutes to, I think, Jesse, when you were talking about microaggressions, somebody asked if in the study that you were referencing, it sounded like the clients reported microaggressions. And this person is wondering if the therapists were aware that they had committed them.
So we didn't have a therapist report in that study. It was only a client reported study. We did follow up with that study, and Karen and I have done 2 of these where we did a microaggression study where therapists watched roughly about 10 minutes of a client-therapist interaction where we embedded a fake client, again, just mock therapy session, where we embedded 3 microaggressions. And what was interesting is only about 50% of the therapists in that study, I believe, identified the very first one, and only like 25% identified all 3. And so it's very easy to miss, even if you're watching it. Obviously, we didn't prime them that they should be watching for microaggressions. We primed them to identify good and bad therapist statements. But what's also interesting, as we've replicated that study for different identities, we've also had people identify the microaggression as a good therapist statement, which is also an interesting kind of dynamic, not just missing it, but also coding it as a positive thing. So there's some interesting things about, are we observing this phenomenon as therapists? And obviously watching somebody else do therapy versus ourselves in session is 2 different things. And so I guess the takeaway for me is, again, what are you doing to elicit feedback from your clients? Maybe not necessarily directly about microaggressions, right? Because that can put people on the spot, but just saying like, hey, has there been anything going on in this relationship as we've been talking that kind of didn't land right for you, didn't sit right for you? Those types of key questions. Obviously checking in for alliance scores is also helpful. And so just building some level of feedback in.
I just wanted to jump in and say that paper with the vignettes in it is a great resource for people. If you take a blank sheet of paper and cover up the responses, it's great for deliberate practice too, to kind of put yourself in that role. Thanks for writing it.
Yeah, of course. All right, we're going to watch our last video here, and then we're going to open it up to questions, I believe. And so while the last video was KT being a client describing an experience, this is Vivian, who, again, fake client on the rupture repair. And this is the same prompt where the therapist is asking her, how do you think things are going?
You say you understand how I feel, and you act as if like you really care. But you'll never know what it's like what me and my family face on a day-to-day basis. I don't even know how someone like you think you can help me, or even know what it's like, where I come from. I know your life is a lot different than mine, but you'll never understand the struggles that we go through every day. It's the same thing. You'll never know what it's like.
Great, so just check in with yourself. What are you noticing? How are you feeling? And what would you say? What are you curious about? What would be your verbatim response to Vivian? Yeah, a lot of good curiosity there around what's getting her upset. Potentially, what did you do as a therapist, maybe to make it worse? Or good, just own. Good statement there by Michael about owning responsibility for the potential error. Great, Lauren talking about as her own identities and noting the privilege there. Yeah, and go ahead. Go for it, Karen.
Several folks have noted their own awareness of feeling a bit nervous and hesitant, not wanting to make Vivian even more upset. And so one of the things to think about is your own identities, your own cultural background, your own experiences around the expression of anger in particular. So Jesse had talked about his awareness that he parents don't argue in front of kids. And so he was very uncomfortable in that couples therapy, that family therapy situation. And this was based on his own identity, his own cultural and family background. And so just sort of ask ourselves, how, their expression of emotion is culturally bound, and we have particularly sort of assumptions about stuff like that.
Yeah, these are some good responses. And again, as you think about the 4 videos that you watched and think about your comfort level from Anthony all the way to Vivian, and it's okay to have like, oh, I could probably connect with, some of these clients a little bit differently, and kind of saying, do I feel comfortable enough? Because really in deliberate practice, you want to find your sweet spot, right? Like if it's too overwhelming to you, you might need to do a little bit more kind of exploration, a little bit more kind of understanding of yourself and understanding of your reactions. And then, if whatever your comfort level is, keep moving it up and keep trying and keep messing up. I mean, that's the nice thing about these videos, is that you're not hurting anybody, right? By responding to these videos. And that's why we developed a lot of these videos, is to help people practice while not exposing clients to us practicing. So that was one of the intents of all these videos. And so there are these videos that we have on MCO Deliberate Practice, or the Deliberate Practice MCO website. Our colleague, Dr. Tony Rosemanier, has developed some other videos as well, and they're open access and free. They are really good videos. They are, the way that they went about developing are really solid. Very different levels of challenge as well in those videos, for sure. Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing, but we're going to open it up to questions.
You want people to just put the questions in the chat?
Sure.
Okay, and then you'll be able to see them. There have been some in the Q&A that I've been.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's hard to monitor it all.
Yeah, so go ahead and put any questions or comments in the chat, folks.
We have time for probably maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, and I think we have a little bit of a lag time. So we're,
Oh, gotcha.
yeah, there's like maybe a 20-second delay, I think, in transmission.
Karen,
I think, yes, some questions came in.
Yeah, Karen, what do you think about that question about, I've been struggling with this as well, this question about like validating the client first, focus on suggestion, like what's your thought? I know there's no easy answer to that, but.
Gosh, yeah, I hesitate to sort of have a sort of formula around this, but one of the ways that I would just sort of make a suggestion around practicing using a cultural focus is that that we do start with maybe a more sort of basic counseling skill, whether it is a reflection of feeling, reflection of meaning, immediacy, or pointing out discrepancy. But then the piece that I think we really would like folks to sort of think about is, how do you bring in the cultural focus? How do you name the thing? So like Jesse said, when appropriate, and maybe not with every client, but being able to say something like, yeah, that sounds racist, and I'm sorry that happened to you. So the difference between I'm sorry that happened to you, that must have been so insulting, and then saying it sounded like you said, it was racist. And so putting those kind of pieces, putting them together. Yeah, that's sort of my first thought on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that we encourage folks to do is just challenge yourself to when you're practicing, at least challenge yourself to do, a multitude of different kind of interventions and see how it fits. It could be a reflection of feeling, could be an interpretation with a cultural focus. Just try it out to see what fits and what doesn't fit. I think when it comes to rupture repair, it might be a little bit different in terms of like owning your responsibility, apologizing for the rupture, exploring the rupture. So I think there are some general tips on the rupture piece that might be a little bit different. I also love this question, and I'm not sure if you had a different one, Karen, but MCO lends itself to dynamic approaches. What about more highly structured or manualized work? That is my favorite question because we developed MCO to be kind of trans-theoretical, right? And so the real question about any kind of manualized treatment or kind of more highly structured treatment is, are you infusing culture within that? Because if not, then you're imposing the culture of that treatment onto the client. And so really trying to explore some ways where the intersections are at, right? So it's not necessarily taking a deviation that's going to be so far off your approach, but rather where are the opportunities to really infuse those pieces, right? So like I think about when I train folks in CBT, which I'm not a CBT expert by any means, but when I think about let's explore automatic thoughts, where do those come from? And then are you listening for kind of cultural themes? Are there cultural values that support these automatic thoughts? Are there some cultural values that support the schema structures of the client, right? And so you can start to think through like, am I thinking that way? Or am I just like labeling this automatic thought one way or the other without kind of unpacking the full cultural aspect of it?
Yeah. And I would highlight the DSM-5 has a cultural formulation interview. And I love the questions that they have included in that. So if you look up for cultural formulation interview, DSM-5, there are a lot of great ones in there that you can integrate into any sort of structured or manualized work, especially in the clinical intake, to really get a sense of how the client is perceiving their presenting issue and so on and so forth. Then the last thing I just wanted to, there was one piece that I hope I don't get your name wrong, Akiva brought up is there's a danger on focusing too much on culture, especially if the client doesn't want to explore. I have definitely fallen into that sort of trap because Jesse had mentioned, part of my training was you got to ask about it. You got to make sure that you're talking about it from the very beginning. So I had this spiel, and I have met up with clients who didn't want to do that. And maybe it was until the 8th session. So finding a way to both create an environment that is not a null environment to culture, being able to just broach it a little bit and then see how the client responds. And then it might not be until the latter sessions that it comes back around. So.
Well, I think we're out of time, right, Tracy?
We're just in our last minute. This has been so great. Thanks to both of you. And I just want to thank everyone for coming and remind you that there is a second part of this research protocol, particularly for trainees. We are offering 4 weeks of free deliberate practice for multicultural orientation coaching groups. I know there were questions about licensed folks being able to participate. Sorry, you're going to have to sit this one out, but we hope to have more opportunities in the future. I did put the DP for therapists link in the chat for the multicultural practice, so you can do some of this work on your own. But yeah, we would love to have trainees join these groups. You'll get an email with a survey. We'd really love for everyone who attended the webinar to complete those measures. And if you're a trainee and want to join one of the groups, we'd love to get that information through the survey. When you close out of Zoom today, you should be taken to that landing page. And if not, don't worry, you'll get an email tomorrow with an invitation to complete the measures. All right, so thank you so much, Jesse and Karen. I know I learned a lot. It was a great discussion. You had a great way of making it engaging, even in this format.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
So much.
All right, good night, everyone.
Bye, everybody.